Hey everyone, it's Kelvin, and once again I'm back at you with another watercolor tutorial for Procreate. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint this watercolor rose bouquet, and the process is surprisingly easy and satisfying, so if you've ever struggled with roses like I have, then this is the video for you. I'm also going to show you a kind of a trick with shading towards the end, and it's basically like a simple 5-second thing that will just immediately improve your illustration by giving them more depth and character. So for this illustration, I'm using the St. Petersburg watercolor paper texture, and I've already got that loaded into Procreate. And for the brushes, I'm going to be doing all of this with the brushes in the regular watercolor kit, and I'll make sure to put links to everything I use down in the description below. Now I know it's pretty hard to see, but I already have sort of a very rough sketch here, and I'll also let you guys download this one, but it's really basic. And that's one thing I like about painting bouquets, is because you can start out with something really simple and abstract and kind of discover it as you paint it. Now I've got my sketch here as the very top layer, and I've set it to multiply, and that's just so it doesn't cover up what we're going to paint, because from now on we're going to be painting on a blank layer underneath the paper texture just like you normally would. Now the first thing I'm going to do is lay down a kind of background wash for each of these roses, and I'm going to do that with the abstract round brush, and that's part of the regular watercolor kit. And for the color, I'm going to use this very light kind of pink color, and I'll just loosely fill these in. Now it's pretty simple, just like what you saw. I did try to leave the edge of it sort of scalloped or a little bit rough, and that just adds to the kind of fluffy look of the flowers. Next, I'm going to make a new layer above that kind of background wash, and I'm going to change the brush to one I don't think I've used before, but it's a really amazing brush actually, very underrated. It's the Smooth Leaf Fade brush, and I'm going to keep the same color basically, but maybe slightly more saturated, and this is what I'm going to use to do all the details for the petals. So normally when I do this, I do each step kind of like a factory, so they'd all be done at the same time, but I know that's more confusing to watch, so I'm going to go through the whole process on just one flower as an example, and then I'll speed up and do the rest of it on the remaining 2 flowers. So with this leaf brush, it actually matters which direction you're painting. So if I paint clockwise, you can see it has a hard edge on the top and a soft edge on the bottom. If I go counterclockwise, it's exactly the opposite. The hard edge occurs at the bottom of the stroke, and the soft edge occurs at the top of the stroke. So for the whole rose, we're going to be making sure that we paint in a clockwise fashion. So I'm going to set this brush to kind of a small size, maybe around 15 or 20%, and I'm going to start from the middle of the flower here, and I'm going to make a little C shape going clockwise, just like that. Then I'm going to add on to it, and the main trick here is that each one of these C's, I'm going to try to keep them the same size as I kind of go out from the center. Maybe they're going to slightly increase in size, but they need to make sure that they're always touching. Some part of them is touching the previous C, and that's kind of a critical thing. Often when I was first starting out making roses, I left too much space, kind of like this, and I ended up with something that didn't look quite right, but eventually I figured out I get a much better result when each of the C's kind of touch and overlap at some point. So I'm just going to go and make a bunch of these, kind of circling around until I get about 1/3 of the way through the rose. So there we go, that's looking pretty good. Now you can see what I mean, where I was trying to keep them kind of the same size, but they do get a little bit longer as I sort of move out from the center. Now at this point, I'm going to use the same color, same brush. I'm just going to increase the size, maybe to around 30 or 40%, and I'm going to do some much larger ones. And they're also going to, as they get larger, they're also going to overlap more. So it's going to look like this. And just so I can get a better look at this, I'm going to turn off the sketch just for now. And after the main shape of the rose petals are laid out, I'm going to select a slightly darker, slightly more saturated version of that same color. I don't want to make it too dark, just a little bit darker. Then I'm going to go over it again, kind of a small size again, maybe 15 or 20%. And I'm basically going to focus some really tiny detailed petals here towards the center, but I'm going to do this much more sparingly. Now as I move out from the center, I'm going to reach these kind of larger petals, and I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to press a lot harder. I haven't changed the size of this brush though. Now next on the roses, I would do a little bit of shading and a little bit of color variation, but I still have 2 more roses I need to paint, so I'm going to finish those up first. Now once all the strokes for the roses are pretty much all finished, I'm going to go over it with the water blender, and I'm going to try to focus this towards the outside. Like, I'm not going to try to blend any of the interior petals. I'm just going to focus on the ones out here. Now once that's finished, I can move on and do the shading, and I'll use this one as a kind of example. And I'm going to do the shading with the selection tool set to freehand. And the first thing I'm going to do is fade the outside of the rose. So I'm going to make what I call a donut shaped selection. And the way I do that is I'll circle around the rose, but I'm not going to join it back. I'm going to jog down kind of about midway through the rose, circle back, jog back up, and then reconnect it. And this is what I call a donut shape selection, because when I feather it, you can see those ends kind of join together, and I'm going to feather it out quite a bit, maybe around 20%. Then I'm going to go to curves for the layer, and I'm just going to grab this bottom node and raise it up, and that's going to lighten and kind of fade those outer petals. So I'll fade it to about midway, something like that. Next, I'm going to darken and shift the center of this rose. So same thing, I'm going to grab the selection tool, set it to freehand, and I'll just circle the center. I'll feather it out, same thing, maybe around 20%. Hue, saturation, and brightness this time. I'm going to saturate it a little bit, and then shift the hue and add in a little bit of magenta. And I'm going to do this same process on the other 2 flowers. Now if I open the layers panel, you can see here are all the stroke details on the flowers, and then here's the background. And sometimes you might accidentally make the background too dark. So I'm going to select the background layer because it did end up a little bit too dark in this case. And I'm going to lighten it by just lowering the opacity. And I want to set it to a point where I can just barely see it, because the lower this is, the higher contrast the petals will have. So if I turn the petals back on, you can see they stand out much better when the background is kind of pretty light. And after you're satisfied with the way the roses look, I'll just pinch those layers together just to keep everything a little bit more organized. Next, I'm going to turn the sketch back on, and I'm going to make a new layer above the roses, and this is where I'm going to paint all the kind of green background detail. And for the brush, I'm going to go back to the abstract round brush, and I'm going to use it at a really small size, maybe around 10%, something like that. And for the color, I'll start with a medium kind of olivey green tone. And using this, I'll just fill out all these stems real quick. Now you'll notice I overlapped on the roses. It's not a big deal because later on I'm going to go through with the eraser and fix that. Next, I can move on and add some of the leaves here. And I'm just going to fast forward through this and just do a variety of stroke-based leaves. I'm going to try to stick with maybe just 2 or 3 different types though. Now once those are all done, I can turn off the sketch, and I don't need it from now on. Now where the branches and leaves are kind of overlapping on the roses, I'm just going to fix that with the eraser. And I've already set that to the fine liner pen, which is part of the regular watercolor kit. And maybe at around 30 or 40%, I'm just going to erase wherever I think that these leaves need to go. Next, I want to add a little kind of color variation with these leaves. They do all look like very similar shades of green, and it's kind of boring in my opinion. So I'm going to use the selection tool set to freehand. and I'll make a just random crazy selection like this. I'll feather it out. Then I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness for the layer. I'll darken it a little bit, saturate it, and then shift the hue, and you can see it kind of introduces a secondary color. And I think for me, I'll stick with something kind of bluish and cold, and there we go, that looks pretty good. Next, I'm gonna go in there with the water blender and fix some of this weird overlapping strokes that we're seeing. So I'm gonna grab the water blender, and at a really small size, I'll just go in there and kind of break up some of those edges. So after we've blended all those overlapping edges, it definitely looks a lot better. I think this is still kind of like an optional step, but I highly recommend it because it just smooths out the whole thing. Next, I want to improve the background of this bouquet, and that's all the kind of white spaces that you see in between there. So what I'm going to do is make a new layer, and I'm going to place it behind the roses, and I'm going to use the same kind of green color that we've been using, but I might select a slightly darker version of it. And using the abstract round brush, I'm just going to go in there at a medium size and add a lot of interesting detail there in the background. And don't worry if it's covering up the roses, because we're going to fix that later on. And there we go. I know it looks pretty awful right now, but if I show you what's going on in the layers panel, it'll make a little bit more sense. So here are all the leaves and stuff, so I'll turn those off. And here are the roses. And this is basically all that we just painted. Now the main issue here is the roses. They're more transparent than the leaves. So what's happening is that green is showing through. So what I'm going to do is select the layer that has all the green. I'm going to grab the eraser brush, and I'm just going to erase it to sort of create a little white space behind each rose to sort of accommodate them so there's no overlap going on anymore. And there we go. So you can see if I turn off the roses, I've just sort of cut a kind of space back there to fit them. And now I can turn everything else back on. Now in most cases, this kind of green layer that we painted here is going to be too dark. So I recommend lightening it. And in this case, I think it's good if I set it around 30 or 40%. There we go. And once you're happy with how everything looks, you can just merge it together onto one layer, and we can move on to doing a little bit of shading next. So in the beginning of this video, I was talking about a shading trick we can use to improve the depth of this illustration. So what I'm going to do is add cold shadows and warm highlights. And I'm going to do that with the selection tool set to freehand. And I'm going to start by doing the shadows. So I'll make a selection that covers those areas that are probably in shadows. Now there's no science here, no trick. I'm just kind of guessing. And there we go. I think those 4 selections are good enough. They're all still active, so I'm going to feather them out all at the same time, and I'll feather them out around 15 or 20%. I'm going to go to hue, saturation, and brightness for the layer, and I'm going to darken it first. So our shadows are darker. I think I might saturate them a little bit, and I'm going to shift the hue to a cooler tone, so something like this. Now in some areas it seems to be getting kind of more affected than other areas, so that's okay. I'll just try not to overdo it. I'll close the selection, and then I'll try again and try to add shadows just a little bit stronger here where I need them. So as you saw, I did sort of have to do the shadows twice. It's just going to depend on how your illustration is, so you might not need to do that. And next I'm going to move on and do the warm highlights. So similar process, I'm just going to grab the selection tool again, set it to freehand, and I'll try to make a selection that covers the areas where I think there'll be a highlight. I think that pretty much covers it. I'll feather that out quite a bit. Then I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness again, but instead of darkening it as we did in the shadows, I'll brighten it up quite a bit. Maybe I'll slightly desaturate it, and I'm also going to try to shift it to a slightly warmer tone. There we go. So this next step is optional, but you might want to add some shadows and highlights to the flowers as well. So I think these look a little bit flat, so I'm going to give it a try. So same thing, I'm going to grab the selection tool, set it to freehand. I'll select an area on the flower where I think there should be a shadow. Feather it out, hue, saturation, and brightness. I'll slightly darken it, saturate it quite a bit, and then shift it over to a slightly cooler color. Then for the highlight, similar thing. Feather it out, hue, saturation, and brightness. And I think I can just brighten it. It's already a pretty warm color, so no need to mess with the hue. I think that looks pretty good. And since that turned out pretty well, I think it suits this illustration, I'm going to continue and do the same thing on the other two flowers. And there we go, this bouquet is all done. And here's what it looks like when I zoom out here, so you can see the full thing on the screen here. And then here's what it looks like when I print it out. I think painting roses this way was really a struggle for me at first, because I knew how they were supposed to look, but I didn't have a lot of experience, so I didn't know how it felt to paint them. So in some sense, it was kind of like, I felt like I was hitting an invisible wall, because I felt like I should be able to paint these, but they just weren't turning out right. So just in case you run into a similar kind of problem, and you keep hitting your head against a project that you know you should paint, but it's just not working out, I have a kind of creativity hack that might help you. When I see some artwork that I want to truly understand and recreate it with my own skills, I will first make an exact stroke for stroke copy of it. And I know it sounds a little bit crazy or boring, and it's definitely pretty boring, but I feel like it's really the only way for me to examine someone else's artwork and truly see it in its full detail. It's like my hands are doing the painting, but my hands are blind. So by copying someone else's artwork exactly, it's like I give my hands a chance to sort of feel out their artwork, and I gain insights into how it's made that I can't get just by looking at it. Now, I know it's a kind of a trick here you've probably never tried, but if you ever get stuck, if you ever have that feeling like you're hitting that invisible wall, just give it a try, and I guarantee it'll help you get through that. And I think with that, that pretty much wraps it up. As always, thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.